David Monroe was the kind of man who seemed to have it all. As the CEO of Orion Global Solutions, a tech empire he built from the ground up, his name was synonymous with innovation and power. His towering presence, sharp suits, and unerring confidence commanded respect in every room he entered. His personal life mirrored his professional triumphs. At least on the surface, David and his wife Isabella were the power couple of their social circle, their chemistry the envy of every gala or corporate party they attended. Yet, beneath the veneer of perfection, David always had an instinct for cracks. He often dismissed these inklings, attributing them to his overactive analytical mind. After all, his ability to dissect data and anticipate patterns had propelled him to the top. But on a particular Thursday evening, as David scanned the GPS history on Isabella's car, his instincts began to scream louder than ever before. She'd told him she was visiting her mother, something she often did on the rare evenings she wasn't involved in one of his business events or her own philanthropic pursuits. Yet, the GPS log didn't match her story. Instead of driving to her mother's estate across town, the digital trail led to a secluded park in the outskirts of the city. David's mind raced, his pulse quickening. He had never been the jealous type. Their marriage was built on mutual respect and trust. But something about this anomaly gnawed at him. Isabella had been unusually distant lately, distracted even when they were alone. Her laughter no longer carried the same warmth, her words sometimes felt rehearsed. The possibility of betrayal crept into his thoughts, uninvited and unwelcome. Despite the storm brewing inside him, David maintained his composure. He was a man of calculated moves, not impulsive reactions. He needed to know the truth, not some half-formed suspicion. Grabbing his coat, he decided to see for himself. The drive to the park felt surreal, a strange contrast to his meticulously structured life. He pulled into the gravel lot and cut the engine, parking a discreet distance away. There, in the dim glow of a distant street lamp, he saw her. Isabella was seated on a weathered bench beneath an old oak tree, her posture relaxed yet alert. She wasn't alone. A man, dressed casually in a leather jacket, stood close, leaning slightly as they spoke. David's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he watched their interaction. Her laugh broke the stillness of the night, a sound so light and carefree it twisted the knife in his chest. She touched the man's arm, a gesture so familiar and intimate that it felt like a slap across David's face. It didn't appear hurried or guilty. If anything, they looked like a couple enjoying a stolen moment of bliss. David's analytical mind worked overtime, piecing together fragments of conversations, shifts in her schedule, and unexplained absences. It all pointed to this: a betrayal unfolding before his eyes. Yet he didn't storm out of the car. He didn't confront her. Instead, he did what he did best: observed. He watched as they lingered, their easy camaraderie a stark contrast to the tension now coursing through his veins. When they finally parted ways, the man walking to a parked motorcycle and Isabella heading back to her car, David made his move. He followed her home, maintaining a safe distance. She entered the house like nothing had happened, her keys jingling as she called out to him. "I'm back. Mum's doing fine," she said casually, hanging her coat on the rack. David emerged from the shadows of his study, his face unreadable. "That's good to hear," he replied, his voice steady. But inside, a storm raged, each piece of the puzzle falling into place. He wasn't just dealing with infidelity. He felt the tremors of something deeper, more insidious, and he knew he couldn't afford to act without understanding the full scope of the betrayal. As Isabella disappeared upstairs, David returned to his study, his mind already devising his next steps. He wouldn't confront her tonight. No, he needed evidence. He needed to uncover not just the who, but the why and the how. And when the time came, he would exact a response so precise and devastating that it would leave no room for denial. For now, he would play the part of the oblivious husband. But in the shadows, he was already building his counterstrike. The following days tested David's composure like never before. Beneath his stoic demeanor, he was a tempest of conflicting emotions: rage, heartbreak, and a simmering resolve to uncover the truth. Every interaction with Isabella became a balancing act, a careful effort to appear normal while gathering the threads of deception she had so expertly woven. It started small. David made a habit of studying her routines, noting every shift in her demeanor. She had always been confident, but now he noticed a certain guardedness. Her phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter, was now glued to her side. When she thought he wasn't looking, she would glance at it, typing quickly before locking the screen. These details, seemingly trivial, spoke volumes to a man who had built an empire by reading between the lines. Late one night, long after Isabella had fallen asleep, David slipped into his study. His home office, a fortress of sleek design and cutting-edge technology, became the stage for his investigation. He started with her phone records. Leveraging his connections, he obtained detailed logs of her recent activity. A name stood out, a number she had been calling and texting frequently over the past few months. The name was Peter Kane, a mid-level executive in one of Orion Global's subsidiary companies. David's mind raced. Why was Isabella communicating with Peter? Their worlds had no obvious overlap. He remembered meeting Peter briefly at a corporate mixer, an unassuming man, far from the charismatic type Isabella usually gravitated toward. Could this be the same man he saw at the park? The discovery was a double-edged blade. It wasn't just personal betrayal, it had professional implications. Peter worked for him. This wasn't just about infidelity, it was about insubordination, a breach of trust within his own ranks. It also hinted at something larger, a scheme that might extend beyond the confines of his marriage. Over the next week, David dug deeper. He installed discreet surveillance software on Isabella's devices, ensuring he could monitor her messages without detection. What he found only deepened the wound. Her texts with Peter were laced with familiarity and flirtation, but there was something else, vague references to the plan and mentions of confidential Orion projects. It wasn't just an affair, it was collusion. The betrayal now carried an unbearable weight. Isabella wasn't merely unfaithful, she was conspiring with Peter to sabotage him, both personally and professionally. David's mind churned with questions. How deep did this go? Were others involved? What was their endgame? Despite the storm within him, David continued to act as if nothing was amiss. He still brought Isabella her morning coffee, still smiled at her anecdotes during dinner, but every word she spoke now felt like a lie. He knew he couldn't confront her yet, not without a complete understanding of her motives and alliances. One evening, Isabella announced she would be attending a charity gala downtown. "You're welcome to come, of course," she said, her tone neutral, "but I assumed you'd be busy with the quarterly reports." David nodded, masking his suspicion. "You assumed correctly. It's crunch time at the office." As soon as she left, dressed in a gown that once would have taken his breath away, David sprang into action. He had already anticipated her excuse and prepared accordingly. Hiring a private investigator had been one of his first moves after that night in the park. Tonight, the investigator would follow her, ensuring David had eyes where he couldn't be. Hours later, the investigator sent a detailed report. Isabella had indeed attended the gala, but she hadn't stayed long. After mingling with the guests and making a brief speech, she slipped away with Peter. They were seen entering a luxury suite at a nearby hotel. David's stomach churned, the confirmation of their affair stoking the fire of his rage. But the investigator had also uncovered something far more concerning. Peter had been meeting with competitors of Orion Global, rival CEOs and investors who had long sought to undermine David's company. It appeared Peter was feeding them insider information, with Isabella acting as a willing accomplice. The betrayal was now multifaceted, a toxic blend of personal and professional treachery. David felt the weight of it crushing down on him, but he refused to let it break him. If anything, it steeled his resolve. He would not be a victim. He would be the architect of their downfall. In the days that followed, David began orchestrating his response. He initiated a silent audit of all Orion subsidiaries, ensuring Peter's activities were under scrutiny. He assigned trusted employees to investigate any anomalies, all under the guise of routine checks. At the same time, he built a dossier on Peter, collecting evidence of his corporate espionage and affair with Isabella. David also reached out to his closest confidant, Sarah Bennett, Orion's chief legal officer. Sarah had been with him since the company's inception, her loyalty and discretion beyond question. Without revealing too much, David hinted at internal issues requiring her attention. "I need you to prepare for a potential legal battle," he said during a private meeting. "We may have a mole." Sarah didn't press for details but assured him she would be ready. Her confidence was a small comfort amidst the chaos consuming his life. On the personal front, David maintained his facade, though every interaction with Isabella felt like a performance. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, she leaned against him, her hand resting on his arm. "You've been quiet lately," she said, her voice soft. "Is everything okay?" David looked at her, forcing a smile. "Just work stress," he replied, his tone even. "You know how it is." She nodded, seemingly satisfied with his answer. But inside, David marveled at her audacity. How could she sit there, so calm and composed, knowing what she had done? The sheer gall of it fueled his determination. As the days turned into weeks, David's plan began to take shape. He scheduled a board meeting under the pretense of discussing a new acquisition. In reality, it was a calculated move to bring Peter into the spotlight. He also began arranging for a forensic audit of Isabella's financials, suspecting she might have received payments or kickbacks from his rivals. Every night, as Isabella slept soundly beside him, David reviewed his progress, ensuring no detail was overlooked. He knew the confrontation would come soon, and when it did, he needed to be armed with irrefutable evidence. But it wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming control. David refused to let their betrayal define him. He would expose them for what they were, ensuring they bore the full weight of their actions. As he closed his laptop one night, a new thought struck him. A chilling possibility he hadn't considered before. What if Isabella wasn't the mastermind behind this betrayal? What if she was just a pawn in a larger game? The idea unsettled him, adding another layer of complexity to the web he was unraveling. For now, he pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. The truth would reveal itself in time, and when it did, David would be ready. The day of the board meeting arrived, a pivotal moment in David's calculated strategy. The large conference room at Orion Global was a hive of activity as executives filed in, each one greeting David with respect and a hint of trepidation. His presence had always commanded attention, but today his calm exterior masked a storm brewing beneath the surface. Peter Kane entered last, looking slightly harried but still confident. He offered David a cordial nod, the kind exchanged between colleagues with no love lost. David returned the gesture with a measured smile, already anticipating the chaos that would soon follow. The meeting began like any other: dates on quarterly performance, discussions on market trends, and strategies for upcoming projects. But halfway through, David redirected the agenda. "I've called for a deeper discussion on security protocols and insider threats," he announced, his voice steady but laced with authority. The room grew quiet, the shift in tone palpable. "In light of recent intelligence, I believe it's time we address vulnerabilities within our organization." Peter stiffened, though he quickly masked it with a casual adjustment of his tie. David didn't miss the fleeting look of unease. He continued, presenting a series of slides that outlined general concerns about corporate espionage, using examples from competitors to illustrate the importance of vigilance. What followed was a carefully constructed interrogation. David began posing open-ended questions to the group, steering the conversation toward accountability. "What measures do we currently have in place to detect irregular communications with external entities?" he asked, his gaze sweeping the room but lingering on Peter for a fraction too long. Peter's response was confident but vague, peppered with industry jargon that failed to address the crux of the question. David pressed further, his tone remaining professional but firm. "And how do we ensure these measures are foolproof? Are we regularly auditing these channels?" Peter faltered slightly, his composure cracking just enough for others to notice. By the time the meeting adjourned, David had successfully planted seeds of doubt in the minds of his executives. They wouldn't act on them yet, but the groundwork was laid. Later that evening, David sat in his study, reviewing the footage captured by the private investigator. The images of Isabella and Peter together, laughing, whispering, and exchanging what could only be described as conspiratorial glances, were damning. But it wasn't just the affair that consumed David's thoughts. He needed to know the extent of their collusion. What were they planning, and how much damage had already been done? He decided to test Isabella's resolve. Over dinner, he brought up a hypothetical scenario involving corporate sabotage, framing it as a recent industry trend. "Can you believe some people would go to such lengths to undermine a company?" he asked, watching her closely. Isabella barely hesitated. "That's terrible," she replied, her voice steady, but David caught the slight tension in her jaw, the way her fork lingered just a second too long before she resumed eating. "You'd think they'd at least have the decency to keep personal relationships out of it," David added casually. "Huh?" Her hand froze mid-motion for a fraction of a second before she quickly recovered, offering a non-committal hum. That night, David combed through her financial records. The forensic audit he had requested had revealed several payments made to a shell account linked to Peter. The sums weren't enormous, but they were frequent enough to suggest a pattern. The payments coincided with key moments in Orion's corporate calendar: product launches, acquisitions, and major board decisions. The next morning, David called Sarah Bennett to his office. "I need you to draft a termination notice for Peter Kane," he said, sliding a file across the desk. It contained the evidence he had gathered so far. "Make it airtight, no room for negotiation or legal loopholes." Sarah flipped through the file, her expression hardening as she read. "This is serious, David. Are you prepared for the fallout?" "Absolutely," David replied. "But this isn't just about Peter. There's someone else involved, someone much closer." Sarah hesitated, her gaze searching his. "Isabella?" David nodded. "I'm not ready to confront her yet. Not until I know the full extent of her involvement." Over the next week, David orchestrated Peter's downfall with precision. An anonymous tip to the board revealed Peter's meetings with Orion's competitors, supported by irrefutable evidence. His termination was swift and public, a clear message to anyone who dared to undermine the company. The fallout was immediate. Rumors swirled, and the media seized on the story, speculating about the implications for Orion Global. Internally, the move sent shockwaves through the ranks. Employees whispered about Peter's betrayal, wondering who else might be complicit. Isabella, for her part, seemed unusually quiet during this time. David noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor: nervous glances, distracted responses, and an uncharacteristic reluctance to engage in conversation. She had to know Peter's termination was more than just a routine corporate decision. But she didn't bring it up, and David didn't offer any explanation. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Isabella finally broke the silence. "The news about Peter," she began hesitantly. "It's all over the papers. Must have been a tough decision." David studied her carefully before responding. "It was necessary. He violated the trust of the company." She nodded, her expression inscrutable. "I hope it doesn't affect morale too much. People will be on edge." "Better they're on edge than complacent," David replied evenly. "Sometimes you have to make hard choices to protect what you've built." The conversation ended there, but the tension between them lingered. David could feel the walls closing in around her, the weight of her secrets pressing down. She was unraveling, and it was only a matter of time before she cracked. But David wasn't done yet. He needed one final piece of the puzzle before he confronted her. Using the surveillance software he had installed, he intercepted an email exchange between Isabella and an unknown recipient. The messages were cryptic, but they hinted at a larger conspiracy involving Orion's intellectual property. David's heart sank as he read the final line of Isabella's email. "We need to move quickly before he suspects anything." It was the confirmation he had been waiting for and dreading. Isabella wasn't just a passive participant in Peter's schemes. She was actively working against him, plotting to undermine everything he had built. The revelation hit him like a freight train, the enormity of her betrayal threatening to consume him. But as the initial shock subsided, it was replaced by a cold, calculated resolve. Isabella had made her move. Now it was his turn. The stage was set for the final act, and David was ready to play his role to perfection. The morning sunlight filtered through the grand windows of the Monroe estate, casting long golden shadows across the living room. David sat in his favorite armchair, sipping coffee from a sleek porcelain mug. His mind, however, was far from the tranquility of the scene. Today was the day he would confront Isabella, the culmination of weeks spent piecing together the intricate web of lies she and Peter had woven. In his hand was a folder, a symbol of the careful strategy he had executed to this point. Inside were the damning records, intercepted emails, payment logs, surveillance photos, and detailed reports from his private investigator. Each piece of evidence was like a dagger, sharp and undeniable. He had considered waiting longer, extracting more information, but his patience had its limits. Isabella's recent actions suggested she was preparing to act again, perhaps to cut ties with Peter, perhaps to escalate their plot. David couldn't afford to wait for her next move. He had chosen a Sunday for this confrontation, a day they would typically spend together at home. The absence of external distractions would amplify the weight of their conversation. As the clock struck noon, Isabella descended the stairs, her usual grace shadowed by the tension that had become a silent third presence in their marriage. She wore a casual sundress, her smile radiant yet somehow strained. "Morning," she said, brushing a kiss on his cheek. "You're up early for a Sunday?" "Couldn't sleep," David replied, his tone neutral. "Too much on my mind." She poured herself a glass of orange juice, oblivious to the storm brewing in the room. David watched her carefully, studying the lines of her face, the way she moved. He wondered if she had any inkling of what was coming. "I was thinking," he began, setting his mug down, "about trust." Isabella paused, her hand lingering on the refrigerator door. She turned to face him, her expression curious but wary. "Trust? That's an interesting topic for a Sunday morning." David gestured toward the seat opposite him. "Have a seat. I want to talk about us." Her brow furrowed slightly, but she complied, taking the seat with an air of cautious curiosity. "What's on your mind?" David leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You know, I've always prided myself on my ability to see patterns, to connect dots where others might not. It's what's made me successful, both in business and in life." Isabella nodded slowly, her expression guarded now. "Yes, you've always been good at that. That's why it's so surprising to me," he continued, his voice steady, "that I didn't see this sooner." He slid the folder across the table toward her. "Go ahead, open it." Her fingers hesitated on the edge of the folder, her eyes flicking to his. "What is this?" "It's everything," David replied, his tone sharpening. "Every lie, every betrayal, every moment you thought I wasn't paying attention." For a moment, Isabella didn't move. Then, with trembling hands, she opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the documents inside, the blood draining from her face as she absorbed the evidence. The surveillance photos of her and Peter in the park, the financial records showing the transfers to Peter's shell account, the intercepted emails plotting against Orion. Each page seemed to hit her like a physical blow. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wide with panic. "David, I can explain." "Explain?" David interrupted, his voice rising. "Explain what, Isabella? That you've been sleeping with Peter Kane? That you've been funneling corporate secrets to him and my competitors? Or that you've been plotting to destroy everything I've built?" Tears welled in her eyes, but David felt no sympathy. Not anymore. "It wasn't like that," she stammered. "Peter, he manipulated me. He made me feel..." "Feel what?" David snapped. "Neglected? Unimportant? Is that your excuse for betraying me?" Isabella's voice broke. "I didn't want to hurt you, David. I just..." "Didn't want to hurt me?" He laughed bitterly. "You didn't think about hurting me when you were meeting him in that park. You didn't think about hurting me when you were sharing confidential company information. And you certainly didn't think about hurting me when you sent that email about moving quickly before I suspected anything." Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands. "I made a mistake," she whispered. "I was scared. I thought Peter would protect me." "Protect you from what?" David demanded, his voice cutting through her sobs like a knife. "From me? From the man who spent his life providing for you, building a future for us?" Isabella looked up, her face streaked with tears. "You don't understand, David. Peter said if I didn't help him, he'd ruin us. He said he had dirt on you, things that could destroy your career." David's jaw tightened. "And you believed him? You chose to trust a man like that over your own husband?" Her silence was answer enough. David stood, pacing the room, his hands clenched into fists. He felt like a volcano on the brink of eruption, his anger barely contained. "You don't even realize what you've done," he said finally, his voice low but trembling with fury. "You didn't just betray me. You put our entire company, our entire livelihood at risk." "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she sobbed. "I thought I could control it." "Well, you didn't," David shot back. "And now you're going to face the consequences." Her head snapped up, panic flashing in her eyes. "David, please, don't ruin me. Don't make this public. I'll do anything to fix it, just please." For a moment, David stared at her, the woman he had once loved with all his heart, now reduced to a desperate, broken shell of herself. He felt no triumph in her suffering, only a deep, hollow ache where his trust had once been. "You want to fix it," he said coldly. "Then you're going to help me dismantle everything Peter has built. You're going to come clean to the board about your involvement, and then you're going to sign over everything, your shares, your accounts, your access, to me. No arguments, no negotiations." "Oh no," her eyes widened. "David, you can't." "I can," he interrupted, "and I will. You don't get to walk away from this unscathed." Isabella broke down completely, her sobs echoing through the room. David watched her without a flicker of emotion. He had loved her once, but that love had been extinguished by her betrayal. "I'll give you until tomorrow to decide," he said, his voice ice cold. "If you cooperate, I'll keep this quiet. If you don't, I'll make sure everyone, our friends, our family, the media, knows exactly what you've done." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the living room with the folder that contained her downfall. As he climbed the stairs to his study, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The confrontation was over, but the battle was far from won. There were still loose ends to tie up, still questions to answer. And deep down, David couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something Isabella hadn't told him, something even darker lurking beneath the surface. David sat alone in his study late into the night, the soft glow of his desk lamp illuminating the neatly stacked documents before him. The confrontation with Isabella had left him drained, but there was no time for rest. The battle was not yet over. He had won the first skirmish, but the war, won against Peter, his competitors, and the lingering tendrils of betrayal, remained. The next morning, Isabella approached him with tear-streaked eyes and a trembling voice. "I'll do what you ask," she said quietly, barely meeting his gaze. Her surrender felt hollow to David. There was no satisfaction in seeing her broken, only a deep ache for the life they had once shared and the trust she had shattered. David handed her a pen and the documents that would sever her ties to Orion Global and protect the company from further harm. Isabella hesitated, her fingers hovering over the page, before finally signing her name. "What happens to me now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Depends on how honest you've been," David replied coldly. "If you're hiding anything else, I'll find it." Her lips parted as if to protest, but she said nothing. She knew better than to argue. With the papers signed, David had the leverage he needed to isolate her from Orion entirely. With Isabella's cooperation secured, David turned his attention to the man who had orchestrated the betrayal. Peter Kane had vanished after his termination, retreating into the shadows, but David knew that no one in Peter's position stayed hidden for long. Using his network of contacts and the resources of Orion's security team, David tracked Peter's movements to a private retreat just outside the city. Instead of confronting Peter directly, David opted for a more strategic approach. He needed to dismantle not only Peter's reputation, but also the network of alliances he had built with Orion's competitors. David's first move was to expose Peter's dealings with rival companies. Through carefully placed leaks to the media, he ensured that Peter's name became synonymous with corporate espionage. Stories of his underhanded tactics spread like wildfire, tarnishing his credibility and making him a liability to anyone who might have considered working with him. David also reached out to the CEOs of the rival companies involved, offering them a stark choice: cooperate with him to mitigate the fallout, or face public scrutiny for their complicity in Peter's schemes. Most of them, fearing the damage to their own reputations, agreed to cut ties with Peter and share what they knew. Piece by piece, David built a dossier that revealed the full scope of Peter's treachery. Meanwhile, Isabella's involvement continued to haunt David. Despite her cooperation, he couldn't shake the feeling that she had withheld something during their confrontation. He decided to test her loyalty one final time. "Isabella," he said one evening, his tone deceptively calm, "I need to know if there's anyone else involved. Someone you haven't told me about." She hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. "No," she said, her voice barely audible. "It was just Peter." David studied her carefully. Her body language betrayed her, the subtle shift of her eyes and the tension in her shoulders speaking louder than her words. He decided to push further. "If you're lying to me," he said, leaning forward, "I will find out, and when I do, there won't be any more deals." Her composure broke. "There was someone else," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "One of Peter's contacts, a man named Victor Latham. He handled the logistics, the money transfers, the information exchanges. I didn't interact with him directly, but I knew he was involved." David's jaw tightened. Victor Latham was a name he recognized, a shadowy figure known for his dealings in corporate sabotage and black market intelligence. The revelation deepened the betrayal, confirming that Peter and Isabella's actions had been part of a far-reaching conspiracy. Armed with this new information, David expanded his investigation. He worked tirelessly with Sarah Bennett, Orion's chief legal officer, to build an airtight case against Victor and his network. They uncovered a trail of encrypted communications and financial transactions linking Victor to several high-profile corporate breaches. David's final move was a coordinated strike. With the evidence in hand, he approached federal authorities, ensuring Victor and his associates were brought to justice. Simultaneously, he launched a public relations campaign to restore Orion's reputation, framing the exposure of the conspiracy as a testament to the company's resilience and integrity. The fallout was swift and decisive. Victor Latham was arrested, his empire dismantled. Peter Kane, now a pariah in the business world, faced lawsuits from multiple companies. And Isabella, stripped of her role in David's life and business, retreated into obscurity. As the dust settled, David found himself alone in the expansive house that had once felt like a home. The silence was deafening, a stark reminder of the price he had paid for the truth. Yet, in the midst of his solitude, he felt a sense of clarity. The betrayal had exposed not only the flaws in his relationships, but also the vulnerabilities in his own life. It was a painful lesson, but one he knew he wouldn't forget. One evening, as he sat in his study, Sarah entered with a glass of whiskey. "You did it," she said, placing the glass on his desk. "Orion is stronger than ever, and the people who tried to destroy it are gone." David nodded, his gaze distant. "At what cost?" he muttered. Sarah hesitated before speaking. "Sometimes we have to burn bridges to move forward. You protected what matters most, David. That's what counts." As she left, David picked up the glass, staring into the amber liquid. He had achieved justice, but the scars of betrayal remained. He knew they would fade with time, but they would never fully disappear. For now, he resolved to focus on the future. Orion was his legacy, and he would ensure it remained unshakable. But he also vowed to rebuild himself, to learn, to grow, and to surround himself only with those who had proven their loyalty. As the city lights twinkled in the distance, David raised his glass in a silent toast. To survival, to strength, and to the unrelenting pursuit of truth.